The bright studio lights cast their usual warm glow across the ESPN set as another Tuesday afternoon show was about to begin. Stephen A. Smith adjusted his tie and glanced at his notes one final time. Across from him sat veteran sports analyst David Chen, a man who had been covering basketball for over 15 years. The topic of today's discussion was supposed to be simple: the rising popularity of women's college basketball and its newest superstar, Caitlin Clark. What started as a routine sports talk show was about to become something neither host nor guest could have predicted. The show's producer gave the countdown signal from behind the cameras. 3, 2, 1. The red recording light flickered on, and Stephen A. flashed his trademark confident smile toward the camera. Good afternoon, sports fans, and welcome back to another edition of our daily sports talk. I'm Stephen A. Smith, and today we're diving deep into one of the hottest topics in college basketball right now: the incredible rise of Iowa's Caitlin Clark and what her success means for women's basketball as a whole. He turned toward his guest with professional courtesy. Joining me today is longtime basketball analyst David Chen, who's been covering the sport for more than a decade. David, thanks for being here with us today. David nodded stiffly, his expression already showing signs of discomfort. Thanks for having me, Stephen A. Though I have to say I'm not sure I share the same enthusiasm about this Caitlin Clark situation that everyone else seems to have. The comment hung in the air for a moment. Stephen A. raised an eyebrow, sensing this might not be the straightforward discussion he had planned. Oh, really? Tell us more about that, David. What's your take on what she's been doing on the court? David shifted in his chair, his voice taking on a tone that immediately caught the attention of everyone in the studio. Look, I've been watching basketball for a very long time. I've seen players come and go, seen media darlings rise and fall. And what I'm seeing with Caitlin Clark right now feels very familiar, and not in a good way. The camera operators exchanged quick glances. This wasn't the usual back and forth they were used to filming. Something felt different about David's energy today. She's getting way too much attention for what she's actually accomplished, David continued, his voice growing slightly louder. I mean, we're talking about a college player who hasn't even won a national championship yet. But the media is treating her like she's already the greatest thing since sliced bread. Stephen A. leaned back in his chair, his media instincts telling him to let David continue talking. Sometimes the best television happened when you just let people reveal themselves naturally. And don't even get me started on all these record-breaking performances everyone keeps talking about, David said, making air quotes with his fingers. Records in women's college basketball? Come on. The level of competition isn't even close to what we see in men's basketball. It's like being the tallest person in a room full of middle schoolers. The studio fell unusually quiet. Even the cameramen seemed to pause their usual movements. Behind the cameras, the show's producer was frantically scribbling notes, trying to figure out how to handle what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable situation. Stephen A.'s expression began to change. The professional smile that had been on his face since the show started was slowly fading, replaced by something much more serious. David, that's a pretty strong statement you're making there. Are you suggesting that Caitlin Clark's achievements don't deserve recognition? I'm saying the recognition is completely out of proportion to what she's actually done. David shot back, his voice now carrying a sharp edge. We've got players in men's basketball who are doing incredible things every single night, but they're not getting a fraction of the media coverage this girl is getting. It's not fair, and it's not based on merit. The word girl seemed to echo in the studio. Stephen A.'s jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his professional composure. So you think the coverage is unfair because she's a woman playing women's basketball? I think the coverage is unfair because it's manufactured hype, David replied, his confidence growing as he spoke. The media has decided they want to create a star, so they're pushing this narrative that she's some kind of basketball genius. But when you actually break down her game, when you look at the real numbers, it's just not there. Social media was already beginning to buzz. Viewers watching live were posting clips and comments faster than the show's social media team could monitor. The hashtags were starting to trend, and not in a good way. Let me ask you something, David, Stephen A. said, his voice taking on the tone that regular viewers knew meant business. Have you actually watched her play? Like really watched her games from start to finish? Of course I've watched her play, David responded defensively. That's exactly why I know this is all hype. She's a decent shooter, sure, but she's not doing anything that dozens of other players couldn't do if they got the same opportunities and the same media push. The same opportunities, Stephen A. repeated, his eyebrows rising. David, are you seriously suggesting that women's college basketball players get the same opportunities as men? I'm suggesting that within women's basketball she's not as special as everyone's making her out to be, David clarified, but his tone suggested he wasn't backing down from his broader point. There are players who have been grinding for years, who have better fundamentals, who understand the game better, but they're not getting attention because they don't fit whatever narrative the media wants to push. The studio audience, a small group of ESPN employees and guests, was becoming visibly uncomfortable. Some were checking their phones, probably, looking at the social media reaction that was undoubtedly exploding. Others were exchanging worried looks with each other. Stephen A. sat forward in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him. This was a posture that anyone who knew him well would recognize as a warning sign. David, help me understand something here. Are you saying that Caitlin Clark doesn't deserve the recognition she's getting? That her scoring records, her assist numbers, her ability to fill arenas and get people excited about women's basketball, that none of that matters? I'm saying it's being blown out of proportion, David insisted, his voice rising slightly. And I think it's actually hurting the sport because it's creating unrealistic expectations and taking attention away from players who have actually proven themselves over time. Proven themselves how exactly? Stephen A. asked, his voice still, controlled, but with an undertone that suggested his patience was wearing thin. David paused for a moment, seeming to realize that he might be walking into dangerous territory. But instead of pulling back, he doubled down. Look, I've been covering basketball for 15 years. I know talent when I see it. And what I see with Caitlin Clark is a player who's good at one thing, scoring points, but who gets way more credit than she deserves because the media needs a story to sell. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Stephen A. stared at David for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of what was clearly becoming more than just a sports debate. In living rooms, across America, viewers were reaching for their phones, typing furious responses to what they were hearing. The show's comment sections were filling up faster than moderators could keep up with. Something told everyone watching that this was just the beginning of what was about to become a very memorable television moment. The tension in the studio was thick enough to cut with a knife. Stephen A. Smith's question hung in the air, waiting for an answer that everyone somehow knew was going to make things worse. David Chen looked directly into the camera for a moment, then back at Stephen A., his expression showing he was about to dig himself into an even deeper hole. You want to know what I really think? David said, his voice carrying a confidence that didn't match the uncomfortable energy filling the room. I think we're doing a disservice to real basketball talent by pretending that what Caitlin Clark is doing is somehow revolutionary or groundbreaking. Stephen A.'s fingers drummed silently on the desk. A habit viewers had learned meant he was trying to keep his composure. David, I need you to be very careful about what you're saying here. You're talking about a young woman who has broken numerous records and brought unprecedented attention to women's college basketball. That's exactly my point, David interrupted, holding up his hand. Unprecedented attention for what? For scoring a lot of points against competition that frankly isn't at the same level we see elsewhere? We're acting like she invented basketball, when really she's just benefiting from being in the right place at the right time with the right marketing machine behind her. Behind the cameras, the show's director was frantically trying to figure out how to handle the situation. She could see the social media notifications exploding on her phone, and none of them were positive. The show's Twitter mentions were increasing by hundreds every minute, and the tone was getting uglier by the second. Marketing machine, Stephen A. repeated, his voice rising slightly for the first time. David, are you seriously suggesting that Caitlin Clark's success is because of marketing, rather than her actual performance on the basketball court? David leaned forward, seemingly energized by Stephen A's reaction. I'm saying that there are dozens of players in men's basketball right now who are putting up better numbers, showing better fundamentals, and demonstrating higher basketball IQ. But they're not getting magazine covers and primetime television coverage because they don't fit the story that sports media wants to tell right now. What story is that, David? Stephen A asked, his tone becoming sharper. What story do you think we're trying to tell? The story that women's basketball is suddenly at the same level as men's basketball, David replied without hesitation. The story that we should all be just as excited about women's college games as we are about the NBA or men's March Madness. And look, I'm not saying women can't play basketball. But let's be honest about the level of athletic ability and competition we're talking about here. The studio audience was now openly uncomfortable. Some people were shifting in their seats, others were checking their phones, and a few were giving each other looks that clearly said they couldn't believe what they were hearing. Stephen A sat back in his chair, his expression changing from professional annoyance to something much more serious. David, I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Are you telling me that you think Caitlin Clark doesn't deserve the recognition she's getting because you don't think women's basketball is worth paying attention to? I'm saying the recognition is completely out of proportion to the actual achievement. David shot back, his voice getting louder. We're talking about a player who hasn't won a national championship, who plays in a league with a fraction of the athletic ability you see in men's basketball, but she's being treated like she's the next Michael Jordan. It's ridiculous. The comparison to Michael Jordan seemed to flip a switch in Stephen A's demeanor. His jaw clenched, and for the first time since the show started, he looked genuinely angry rather than just professionally challenged. Did you just compare Caitlin Clark to Michael Jordan in order to diminish what she's accomplished? Stephen A asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I'm saying people are making comparisons that don't make sense, David replied, apparently not recognizing the warning signs. We're so desperate to create stars in women's sports that we're willing to pretend that good performance at that level is the same as great performance at higher levels of competition. In living rooms across the country, viewers were having very different reactions to what they were watching. Some were agreeing with David's points about competition levels, while others were becoming increasingly upset with his dismissive tone. The show's comment sections were filling up with arguments between viewers, and the hashtags were trending nationwide. Let me ask you something else, David, Stephen A said, his voice taking on the tone that longtime viewers knew meant someone was about to get demolished. How many Caitlin Clark games have you actually attended in person? David paused for a moment, clearly not expecting that question. I don't need to attend games in person to analyze basketball performance. I can see the statistics, I can watch the footage, I can evaluate the level of competition. So that's a 0, Stephen A said flatly. You haven't been to a single game where this young woman has played, but you're sitting here telling me and our viewers that her achievements don't matter because you've decided the competition isn't good enough. The statistics speak for themselves, Stephen A. David replied defensively. You don't need to be in the arena to read numbers and understand what they mean in context. Context, Stephen A repeated, leaning forward. Let's talk about context. David, the context is that this young woman has broken records that have stood for decades. The context is that she's filling arenas with fans who have never cared about women's college basketball before. The context is that she's inspiring young girls across the country to pick up basketballs and believe they can achieve something special. But that's exactly what I'm talking about, David interrupted, his frustration showing. We're focusing on inspiration and feelings instead of actual basketball performance. We're letting emotion cloud our judgment about what constitutes real excellence in the sport. The word emotion seemed to hang in the air like a red flag. Stephen A's expression hardened even more, and several people in the studio seemed to sense that things were about to escalate significantly. Emotion? Stephen A said, his voice dropping to a level that was almost menacing. David, are you suggesting that people who appreciate Caitlin Clark's achievements are being emotional instead of rational? I'm suggesting that we're not being objective about her actual basketball ability compared to other players, David replied. apparently not realizing how his words were being received. We're getting caught up in the story and the hype instead of focusing on what really matters, which is performance at the highest levels of competition. Stephen A. stood up from his chair, something that almost never happened during the middle of a segment. The camera operators quickly adjusted their angles to capture his full presence as he looked down at David, who suddenly seemed much smaller than he had moments before. "David," Stephen A. said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority and reputation, "I think you need to be very, very careful about what you say next. Because right now you're not just questioning a player's abilities. You're dismissing an entire sport, disrespecting countless athletes, and frankly, you're starting to sound like someone who has a problem that goes way deeper than basketball analysis." The studio fell completely silent. Even the usual background noise of cameras and equipment seemed to stop as everyone waited to see what would happen next. David looked up at Stephen A., finally seeming to realize that he might have pushed things too far, but his expression suggested he wasn't ready to back down. The silence in the studio stretched for what felt like forever. Stephen A. Smith stood towering over David Chen, his usually animated hands now perfectly still at his sides. Everyone in the room could feel that something big was about to happen. The camera operators kept their shots steady, knowing that whatever came next would probably be replayed thousands of times across social media. David looked up at Stephen A., and for a brief moment it seemed like he might apologize or back down from his comments. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone in the room. He smiled. "Stephen A., I think you're getting a little too worked up over this," David said with a condescending tone that made several people in the studio visibly cringe. "This is supposed to be sports analysis, not some emotional tribute to a college player who hasn't even proven she can win when it really matters." That was the match that lit the fuse. Stephen A.'s face went through a transformation that viewers would talk about for years afterward. The professional mask he had worn for the entire show dropped completely, replaced by raw, genuine anger that seemed to fill the entire studio space. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, and when he spoke, his voice carried a power that made everyone in the room lean forward. "Emotional?" Stephen A. said, his voice starting low but building like a gathering storm. "You think I'm being emotional, David? You think defending a young woman who has worked her entire life to achieve something special is emotional?" David opened his mouth to respond, but Stephen A. wasn't finished. Not even close. "Let me tell you what's emotional, David," Stephen A. continued, his voice rising with each word. "What's emotional is sitting in that chair and tearing down a young athlete because you can't stand the fact that she's getting attention that you think should go somewhere else. What's emotional is dismissing an entire sport because it doesn't fit your narrow definition of what basketball should be." The show's producer was frantically trying to figure out whether to cut to commercial or let the moment play out. She had never seen Stephen A. this angry during a live broadcast, and she wasn't sure what he might say next. But she also knew that this was the kind of television that people would remember forever. "Stephen A., I think you're misunderstanding my point." David tried to interrupt, but his voice sounded weak compared to the force coming from across the desk. "No, David," Stephen A. shot back, his finger now pointing directly at his guest. "You're misunderstanding something much more important. You're misunderstanding what it means to be a professional in this business. You're misunderstanding what it means to show respect for athletes who have dedicated their lives to their sport." Stephen A. began pacing behind his chair, his energy too intense to remain stationary. The cameras followed his movement, capturing every gesture, every expression, every word that was about to become part of sports television history. "Do you know what Caitlin Clark did last week, David?" Stephen A. asked, his voice now carrying the rhythm and power that had made him one of the most recognizable voices in sports media. She scored 41 points in a game that had over 4 million people watching on television. 4 million people, David. That's more viewers than most NBA games get during the regular season. David tried to respond, but Stephen A. was on a roll now and nothing was going to stop him. "But that's not what really matters, is it, David?" Stephen A. continued, his voice rising to a level that made everyone in the studio stop what they were doing and pay attention. "What really matters is that she did it while being double-teamed and triple-teamed by defenders who were trying everything they could to stop her. What really matters is that she did it while carrying her team on her back in front of a crowd that was there specifically to see her play. The studio audience was completely silent now, watching what was clearly becoming one of the most intense moments in recent sports television history. Several people had their phones out, recording what they knew would be shared millions of times before the day was over. "And you know what else matters, David?" Stephen A. said, his voice now reaching the crescendo that viewers would remember long after the show ended. "What matters is that young girls across this country are watching her play and believing for the first time that they can achieve something special in basketball too. What matters is that she's bringing attention and respect to a sport that has been ignored for too long." David made one final attempt to defend his position, and it was the worst mistake he could have made. "Stephen A., you're acting like she's some kind of saint," David said, his voice carrying a dismissive tone that seemed to echo through the studio. "She's just a basketball player who happens to be good at scoring points. The way you're talking about her, you'd think she was curing cancer or solving world peace." The words hung in the air for exactly 2 seconds before Stephen A. exploded. "You are filthy," Stephen A. roared, his voice so loud and powerful that it seemed to shake the cameras. "You are absolutely filthy for sitting in that chair and diminishing what this young woman has accomplished." The studio erupted. Camera operators jumped, the director dropped her coffee, and several people in the audience audibly gasped. David's face went completely white as he realized that he had pushed Stephen A. past a point of no return. "How dare you?" Stephen A. continued, his voice still booming but now carrying a tone of moral authority that commanded attention from everyone in the room. "How dare you sit there and act like what she's doing doesn't matter? How dare you dismiss her achievements because they don't fit your narrow, outdated view of what basketball should be?" Stephen A. was now leaning over the desk, his face inches from David's, his finger pointing directly at the man who had clearly underestimated who he was dealing with. "You want to talk about what really matters in basketball, David?" Stephen A. said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that was somehow more powerful than his shouting had been. "What really matters is heart. What really matters is dedication. What really matters is the ability to inspire people and bring them together around something beautiful." David sat frozen in his chair, clearly realizing that he had made a terrible mistake but having no idea how to fix it. "And you know what else is filthy, David?" Stephen A. continued, straightening up to his full height again. "What's filthy is the jealousy that's dripping from every word you've said today. What's filthy is the bitterness that's so obvious in your voice when you talk about her success." The cameras captured every moment, every expression, every word that was turning what started as a routine sports debate into a defining moment in television history. Social media was exploding with clips and reactions. Hashtags were trending worldwide, and millions of people were watching a man stand up for what he believed was right. "You're jealous, David," Stephen A. said, his voice now carrying a finality that suggested this conversation was about to reach its conclusion. "You're jealous that a young woman is achieving something you never could. You're jealous that she's getting the recognition and respect that you think you deserve. And that jealousy has made you say things today that you should be ashamed of for the rest of your career." The studio fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence that comes after something important has been said, after a line has been crossed that can never be uncrossed. The silence that followed Stephen A.'s explosive outburst was deafening. David Chen sat in his chair looking like he had just been hit by a truck. His face was pale, his hands were shaking slightly, and for the first time since the show began, he seemed to understand the gravity of what had just happened. But instead of backing down or apologizing, David made a decision that would seal his fate. He decided to fight back. "Stephen A., you need to calm down," David said, his voice trying to sound authoritative but coming out shaky and defensive. "This is supposed to be professional sports analysis, not some personal attack session. I have every right to express my opinion about basketball players and their level of competition." The wrong words at the worst possible time. Stephen A.'s eyes widened with disbelief. After everything that had just happened, after the explosion of anger and the clear message that David had crossed a line, the man was still trying to justify his comments. "Calm down," Stephen A. repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You want me to calm down after you spent the last 20 minutes disrespecting a young woman who has worked harder than you ever have in your entire career? David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but instead of staying quiet, he kept digging himself deeper. Look, I'm just being honest about what I see on the basketball court. If people can't handle honest analysis, then maybe they shouldn't be in sports media. Honest analysis? Stephen A. laughed, but there was no humor in it. David, let me tell you about honest analysis. Honest analysis would be talking about how Caitlin Clark has the best three-point shooting percentage in college basketball history while taking more shots than anyone else. Honest analysis would be discussing how she's averaging more assists per game than most point guards, while also leading the nation in scoring. Stephen A. began walking around the desk, moving closer to David with every word. The cameras followed his movement, capturing the intensity that was radiating from him like heat from a fire. Honest analysis, Stephen A. continued, his voice building again, would be acknowledging that she's doing things on a basketball court that haven't been done before, regardless of what level you think the competition is at. But that's not what you've been doing, is it, David? David tried to interrupt, but Stephen A. wasn't having it. No. What you've been doing is letting your personal feelings and your jealousy cloud your judgment, Stephen A. said, now standing directly beside David's chair. What you've been doing is diminishing a young woman's achievements because you can't stand that she's getting attention you think you deserve. I am not jealous, David protested, his voice rising for the first time since Stephen A.'s explosion. I'm a professional basketball analyst with 15 years of experience. I know what I'm talking about when it comes to evaluating talent. 15 years of experience? Stephen A. shot back immediately. 15 years of experience watching from the sidelines while other people achieved greatness? 15 years of experience criticizing players who accomplished things you never could? The personal attack hit David like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and his composure finally started to crack completely. You don't know anything about my playing career, David said, his voice now showing real anger for the first time. I played college basketball. I understand the game at a level that maybe you don't. It was the worst thing he could have said. Stephen. I stopped walking and turned to face David directly, his expression showing a mixture of disbelief and pure fury. Your playing career? Stephen A. said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. Your playing career? David, let me ask you something. How many points did you average in college? David's face went white. He clearly hadn't expected Stephen A. to know anything about his basketball background. That's not relevant to this discussion, David said weakly. How many points, David? Stephen A. pressed, his voice getting louder with each word. How many assists? How many games did you start? How many times did you lead your team to victory when it mattered most? The studio was completely silent except for Stephen A.'s voice. Everyone could sense that this was about to get very personal, very quickly. I'll tell you what's relevant to this discussion, Stephen A. continued without waiting for an answer. What's relevant is that you sat on the bench for most of your college career. What's relevant is that you never achieved anything close to what Caitlin Clark has already accomplished, and that's eating you alive. David tried to stand up, apparently thinking he could somehow regain control of the situation, but Stephen A. was having none of it. Sit down, Stephen A. commanded, his voice carrying such authority that David immediately sank back into his chair. You wanted to talk about basketball credentials, let's talk about them. You averaged 4 points a game as a senior in college. 4 points. Caitlin Clark averages more than that in the first 5 minutes of most games. The attack was brutal and personal, but Stephen A. wasn't finished. You want to talk about competition level? Stephen A. continued, his voice now reaching the same intensity it had during his earlier explosion. You played Division II basketball, David. Division II. And you couldn't even start regularly at that level, but you have the nerve to sit in that chair and criticize someone who's dominating at Division I? David's mouth opened and closed like he wanted to respond, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had been completely destroyed, but Stephen A. still wasn't done with him. Here's what I think really happened today, David, Stephen A. said, leaning down so he was speaking directly into David's face. I think you came on this show planning to tear down a young woman who has achieved everything you always dreamed of achieving. I think you thought you could hide your jealousy behind analysis and statistics. Stephen A. straightened up and began pacing again, his energy too intense for him to stay still. But you know what you didn't count on? Stephen A. continued. You didn't count on the fact that some of us in this business actually care about protecting young athletes from bitter, failed players who want to tear them down to make themselves feel better. The words hit David like physical blows. He sat in his chair looking smaller and smaller with each sentence. And you definitely didn't count on the fact that I was going to call you out for what you really are, Stephen A. said, his voice now carrying a finality that suggested this confrontation was reaching its end. A jealous, bitter man who can't stand to see someone else succeed where he failed. David finally found his voice, but it came out as barely a whisper. Stephen A., I think this has gone too far. Too far? Stephen A. repeated, his voice incredulous. David, we crossed too far about 10 minutes ago when you decided to disrespect a young woman who has never done anything to you except achieve greatness. We crossed too far when you let your personal issues become more important than professional respect. The studio remained completely silent as Stephen A. paused, seemingly collecting his thoughts for what everyone sensed would be his final statement. But you know what, David? Stephen A. said, his voice now calm but carrying an undertone of steel. I'm glad this happened today. I'm glad millions of people got to see exactly who you are and what you represent, because now everyone knows that when you criticize Caitlin Clark, it's not coming from a place of legitimate analysis. Stephen A. looked directly into the camera, addressing the audience for the first time since his explosion began. It's coming from a place of jealousy, bitterness, and personal failure. And that, Stephen A. said, turning back to David, is something that has no place in professional sports media. The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. David Chen sat in his chair looking completely defeated, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. Stephen A. Smith stood over him like a judge about to deliver a final verdict. Everyone in the room could sense that something unprecedented was about to happen. Stephen A. took a deep breath, looked directly into the camera, and then back at David. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried the weight of absolute authority. David, Stephen A. said slowly, I want you to look at me when I say this. David reluctantly raised his eyes to meet Stephen A.'s gaze. What he saw there clearly terrified him. In my 25 years in sports media, Stephen A. continued, I have never had to do what I'm about to do. I have disagreed with guests. I have had heated debates. I have even had people walk off my show. But I have never had someone sit in that chair and display the level of disrespect and unprofessionalism that you have shown today. The show's producer was frantically trying to figure out what Stephen A. was planning to do. She had her hand, hovering over the button that would cut to commercial, but something told her that Stephen A. wouldn't want this moment interrupted. You came on this show today with an agenda, Stephen A. said, his voice growing stronger with each word. You came here planning to tear down a young woman who has worked her entire life to achieve something special. You disguised your jealousy as analysis and your bitterness as professional opinion. David opened his mouth to protest, but Stephen A. held up his hand. I'm not finished, Stephen A. said firmly. You had your chance to speak and you used it to embarrass yourself in this network. Now it's my turn. Stephen A. walked back around to his side of the desk, but remained standing, his presence dominating the entire studio. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen A. said, addressing the camera directly, what you have witnessed here today is exactly what is wrong with sports media. You have seen a man who couldn't achieve his own dreams trying to diminish someone else's achievements out of pure jealousy. Social media was exploding. Hashtags related to the show were trending worldwide, and clips of Stephen A.'s explosion were being shared faster than anyone could count. The show's ratings were climbing by the minute as word spread about what was happening live on television. But you have also seen something else, Stephen A. continued, his voice taking on an inspirational tone. You have seen what happens when someone stands up for what is right. You have seen what happens when we refuse to let bitter, failed individuals tear down our young athletes. Stephen A. turned back to David, who was now looking like he wanted to disappear into his chair. David, I want to ask you one final question, Stephen A. said. Do you have anything to say to Caitlin Clark? Do you have anything to say to the young girls who look up to her? Do you have anything to say to the fans who have fallen in love with women's basketball because of what she has accomplished? David sat silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with what to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I think maybe I expressed my opinions too strongly, David said weakly. Too strongly? Stephen A. repeated, his voice rising. Again. David, you didn't express opinions too strongly. You revealed your character. You showed millions of people exactly who you are as a person and as a professional. Stephen A. paused for a moment, and everyone in the studio could sense that he was about to make a decision that would change everything. And that brings me to what I have to do next, Stephen A. said, his voice now carrying the weight of finality. David, effective immediately, you are no longer welcome on this program. Your credentials as an analyst on this show are revoked. You will not be returning as a guest, and you will not be representing this network in any capacity related to basketball coverage. The studio erupted in gasps and shocked whispers. David's face went completely white as he realized what was happening. Stephen, hey, you can't just fire me on live television, David protested, his voice shaking. I'm not firing you, David, Stephen A. replied calmly. You don't work for me, but I am removing you from my program. And I'm making it clear to our producers and our network that your services are no longer needed or wanted. Stephen A. looked directly into the camera again, addressing the millions of viewers who were watching this unprecedented moment unfold. This is not how I wanted this show to go today, Stephen A. said, his voice sincere and honest. I invited David here to have a respectful discussion about women's basketball and Caitlin Clark's impact on the sport. Instead, what we got was a display of jealousy, bitterness, and unprofessionalism that I simply cannot and will not tolerate. David tried one more time to salvage the situation. Stephen A., maybe we can discuss this off the air. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Stephen A. turned back to him with an expression that was both sad and resolute. David, there's been no misunderstanding, Stephen A. said quietly. You said exactly what you meant to say. You revealed exactly who you are, and now you have to live with the consequences of that choice. Stephen A. gestured toward the exit, and for the first time, viewers could see security personnel who had quietly moved into position near the set. I think it's time for you to leave, Stephen A. said simply. David sat in his chair for a moment longer, apparently hoping that Stephen A. might change his mind. When it became clear that wasn't going to happen, he slowly stood up, his movement shaky and uncertain. This isn't over, Stephen A., David said as he began walking toward the exit. Yes, it is, Stephen A. replied without hesitation. It's completely over. The cameras followed David as he walked off the set, his head down and his shoulders slumped, in defeat. The studio remained silent until he was completely out of view. Stephen A. sat back down at his desk, adjusted his tie, and looked directly into the camera. When he spoke, his voice was calm and professional, but there was still an underlying intensity that showed how much the confrontation had affected him. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to apologize to our viewers for what just happened, Stephen A. said. This is not the kind of television we strive to produce, and it's not the kind of discussion we want to have about our athletes. He paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. But I also want to be clear about something, Stephen A. continued. I will not apologize for defending Caitlin Clark or any other athlete from unfair, unprofessional criticism. I will not apologize for standing up to jealousy and bitterness when I see it, and I will not apologize for expecting better from the people who share this platform with me. Stephen A. leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more personal and direct. Caitlin Clark is a remarkable young woman who has achieved something special, he said. She has brought joy to millions of fans, inspired countless young girls, and elevated women's basketball to new heights. She deserves our respect, our admiration, and our support. The show's producer was signaling that they needed to go to commercial, but Stephen A. held up his hand, indicating he had one more thing to say. To Caitlin Clark, if you're watching this, Stephen A. said, looking directly into the camera, Please know that there are people in this business who see your greatness, who appreciate your hard work, and who will always stand up for you when others try to tear you down. Stephen A. smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. And to everyone else watching, remember this moment. Remember what happened when someone tried to diminish greatness out of jealousy. And remember that sometimes standing up for what's right means making difficult decisions that some people won't understand. The camera held on Stephen A.'s face for a moment longer before finally cutting to commercial, ending one of the most dramatic moments in sports television history.